Okay, everybody, welcome to this panel on climate, energy, and sustainability. The clock is 3:15, so it's time for us to start. My name is Niklas Bremberg. I am a senior research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and I have the great honor to share and moderate this panel. I will also introduce the theme very briefly before I'll hand over to the panelists and the speakers on the panel. We have said that each panelist will talk for about 10 minutes on a theme that relates to the topic of the panel, and then we will kind of move into a discussion phase among the panelists to see to what extent they want to engage with themes and points that they have raised. And then after that, we'll open up to you guys to make comments or contributions on interventions as you see fit. I'd also like to direct, of course, a warm welcome to all of you who follow this panel online. Great. So, of course, it's a broad theme: climate, energy, and sustainability. Oh, sorry. So, I mean, it's a very broad theme. So I thought that was myself, but that was actually Göran. Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so that kind of leakage between the panels we want to avoid, of course. But no, I was saying that it's a very broad theme, of course, and we think it's appropriate to focus on the nexuses between climate, energy, and sustainability. Should I ignore that, just go on, or? Okay. Should we wait a second? We wait, right? No, because you can't understand, yeah. That's not it, that's not good.
Well, that's...
Thank you. Of course. Okay. So, but we think it's very appropriate to kind of interlink these broad themes together, right? So, of course, we've heard from the previous speakers that we are facing unprecedented challenges for the EU, right, at the moment, of course. And the war, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine is, I think, for many of us that have been following the issue of climate and security, really putting a finger on the nexuses between, of course, the geopolitics around climate change and, of course, international security. There is definitely an energy component to this nexus. And there's also, we see an emerging component on kind of the geopolitics around sustainable transition, right? We've heard the increased competition around rare earth materials. We are now kind of experience the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, and how that then is, of course, also affecting trade patterns, or potentially trade patterns that will affect, of course, the EU. And we've seen just recently that the kind of the transition agenda, sustainability and climate, of course, is also shining a light on the EU's geopolitical role. We saw that in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt just recently, when the EU was put in a position where it really couldn't maybe shape the agenda on certain issues such as loss and damages to the extent that it thought it could maybe in the past. So there is definitely, I think, an opportunity now for us to reflect on these kind of interlinkages between these broad issues. So I'm very happy then to be able to introduce to you three very, I think, apt and appropriate speakers to talk about these nexuses. I'll introduce them as they will also speak. I'll introduce them in the same order as they will speak on the panel. So first off, we have Carina Barquet. She is a senior research fellow and team leader of the Water, Coast and Ocean Group at the Stockholm Environmental Institute. She holds a PhD in human geography from the Norwegian University of Science and technology. Her research explores mechanisms of connecting landscape governance with infrastructure diversification as a way to increase resilience to extreme events and inform coastal and marine spatial planning. And she has been focusing primarily in her work on Europe, Sweden, but also Latin America, if I'm not mistaken, Cuba, which of course is very interesting, I think. Carina will talk on the theme of the politics of climate change adaptation at different levels of governance. And then we have Alexandra Palkova, and she is a researcher at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs in Riga, and she's also a senior researcher at the Riga Stradins University, where she's currently pursuing a PhD in international relations. And her research focuses mainly on differentiated integration, European integration topics in general, but also security policy and climate, which is of course very apt for us today. And she's an associate researcher at the European Council of Foreign Relations, and she is also one of the authors of parts of the TEPSA pre-presidency recommendations that I hope all of you have had a chance to look at. And she will talk on the theme of the EU's global economic competitiveness in the current energy crisis. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Simone Bunse, and she is a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute here in Stockholm. She is also a content manager for the CIPRI's flagship initiative, the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, and she holds a PhD in political science from Oxford. Her research expertise covers a lot: comparative politics, European integration, EU policy making, and also decision making in public policy. And she has held numerous positions in the past in the US, in Georgetown, but also there's a Latin American connection. You have also had academic and leadership positions in Costa Rica. I also want to mention one thing that Simona has on her CV, which I think is particularly interesting in our context right now, since we're in a small country in the north part of Europe. She is the author of Small States and EU Governance, a book that won the Choice Outstanding Academic Titles Award of the American Library Association for Excellence in Scholarships. I think that's very, appropriate, of course, since we're now in Sweden, and Sweden is now entering its presidency soon of the EU. And Simona will talk on the theme of the external security dimensions of climate, energy, and sustainability in the EU. So, with that as an introduction, I think it's time for us to then hand over to the panelists. I'll start with you, Carina, about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to the rest of the panelists. Please.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation today. I will ask my colleagues here at the back to help me out with the PowerPoint. Great, thanks. I should warn you, I'm not an EU expert. As my title suggests, I'm working primarily with water-related risks, but very much related to infrastructure, security, and societal resilience. So I guess my presentation today will be a little bit around those issues, and hopefully my colleagues can tell you a lot more of interesting stuff about the EU. Great, we can change, and we can change. Thanks. So Sweden is taking over the chairmanship of the EU, and Sweden is flagging this as an opportunity to show Sweden. And this is quite interesting because this is happening at a moment with multiple cascading risks. And we can change the slide, please.
I thought so.
And one can, of course, debate where the starting point of these risks are. As a researcher in climate environmental issues, I would strongly suggest that the starting point of this is not geopolitics necessarily. It's not the energy crisis as we have heard today and earlier. I would say the starting point for this crisis might very well be the climate crisis. The negligence to do things on time is leading to, or it's more of a question. Is our negligence to getting resilience and adaptation options, particularly when it comes to energy, leading us to where we are today? If we had done something on time 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, would we find ourselves in the same situation that we are today? And so these crises are connected. They feed into each other. And today Sweden stands with this government that we stand. We can change the slide, please. Which is it's polarizing in society, it's polarizing in policy, but it's clear that we have a quite different role than we had just a few months ago. And so today, for those of you who are not Swedish speakers, what this is telling us is that there's a youth organizations that sued the state about a month ago, and this youth organization has strong support from society, and the sue is because the government is not taking seriously climate change as a risk, and there's a series of both research and legal arguments that are being brought forward. Interestingly, for those of you who are not completely aware of Swedish elections, first-time voters voted for the government that's here today. So they voted for more security in terms of higher penalties for criminality and so on, basically the type of policies that we have today. But at the same time, we have another group of youth who are on the other end. So society is very polarized also in Sweden when it comes to many things. We can move on to the next. Thanks. And they did ask us not to put too much text, but because there's some people in the screen, and I know what it is to be behind the screen, you might want to look at what I'm saying as well. So what we're seeing is that in research, I'm a researcher, I represent that group. We increasingly, for many years, for decades, we've called for climate to be recognized as a crisis. It's a crisis that is not being recognized in policy. So we see the watering down of the climate discourse at different levels. In international climate policy, climate is not recognized as a risk. In research, we treat it as a risk multiplier, but not reflected in climate. Nationally, climate policy is not trickling down beyond the discourses. So all of our countries are going to the COPs and to the various dialogues, but this is not really reflecting in national policy. And locally, whatever ends up, whatever of all of these discourses we bring home, it becomes into tick the boxes exercises where we are monitoring things that are not really happening. So I want to sort of connect the discussion of climate adaptation to the discussion of crisis preparedness, because they overlap in terms of impacts many times, not purely, but many times they do. However, they belong to different spheres of action, and if you want, research as well. Crisis preparedness belongs to the sphere of societal risk, whereas climate adaptation is more within the sphere of local planning. And that has implications for how we treat the issue and who deals with it. We also see a difference in the types of events that the one treats and the other one. For example, in climate adaptation, we see more slow onset type of long-term things that might happen once in 100 years. Whereas in crisis preparedness, we see more sudden and more as sort of high impact type of events. There's different laws and regulations associated to each of these type of events, which call for different types of action. Some are way more local, particularly those related to climate adaptation, whereas there's others that call for more regional or national mobilization when it comes to societal risks. Methodologically, we see that the study of impacts from climate change from climate change for societal security is of high relevance for crisis preparedness. We stand today with, first, lack of data, second, very poor mechanisms to share data safely, and climate change research can serve as a proxy in many ways, and this could inform, again, crisis preparedness, and this is regardless of the type of risk studied. And I will speak primarily about some of the research in two projects we are carrying out, which is looking at critical infrastructures, which is a matter for both climate change but also societal resilience, where we see that solutions for both are actually common, and this is not what's being brought forward in policy. We can take the next slide, please. This is, I think, my last slide. So what I'm suggesting here is that climate policy is key to ensure resilience of European societies. And Sweden is in desperate need of a new narrative as it takes over the chairmanship. We lack not only legitimacy in terms of climate, but we might also lack motivation. Our politicians might lack the motivation to put this forward. I think that societal resilience offers a window of opportunity to connect climate and to not let it not to forget it, connecting the climate discussion to society more closely, and for example through the ensuring the safety and resilience of our infrastructures could be a way out. We should, though, think about the consequences of riskifying the climate agenda. In research, this might not be a too unfamiliar topic. However, when it comes to practice, we don't really know what it means in terms of public policy and actual planning. What does it mean to make something that has historically been a planning issue a risk issue? And I would just, before I finalize, would like to remind, maybe some of you know about the EU Commission's report released earlier this October, where they're pushing for increased efforts to strengthen the resilience of the EU's critical infrastructures. And there's three aspects that are underlined: international cooperation, response, but primarily preparedness. The Commission proposes member states to conduct risk assessments to enhance the resilience of infrastructures, including defining what these are and how to treat this. So this is very much in line with what the Commission is proposing, and I believe is very much in line with Swedish current interests. We can take the next and last slide. Please get in touch if you wonder anything.
Thank you very much, Carina. I think we'll stick to the plan, so we'll continue with the panel introductions or the talks. I'll hand over to you, Alexandra, please.
Yep, thank you. I hope that you hear me well. I think that I will be dancing here a lot, as the presentation slide is only behind me. Nevertheless, I wanted to also emphasize that the recommendations was done together with Marco Sidi, so not only by myself at all, so thank you so much. Well, given in your presentation, I think that I will be then the one who will actually bring back EU agenda more closer and to discuss. And I think that we cannot talk about the energy security, climate change without this now all the time world in the agenda resilience, right? So I have three main points which I would like to share with you today and talk today if we actually look on the European Union energy security as well as the climate change and generally energy infrastructure. So I think that we have to talk first of all about energy nationalism, and that's actually concerns me a lot because this is what we tend to forget, but this is where we actually heading right now. The price cap was actually one of the examples where we show how the EU member states actually can be divided with their opinions. And the energy nationalism is important part of it because as we know that the member states have the ability to have this competence over the energy sector. That means that we actually have to talk about the ability to have coordinated member states' energy policy because the member states otherwise can decide of the energy sources, for instance, as we tend to call them energy mixes, right? So how we can ensure that the energy mixes actually have the long or the short-term strategy and the actual results, that it doesn't harm the energy market and it doesn't have the economical competitiveness as well. This is something important what we have to keep in mind when we talk about the energy. And moreover to that, if we look on the broader picture, I think that now we know that the EU fulfilled the storage for this winter, right? But we have to think about immediately after the next winter. So the next winter is there, and I see a lot of the concerns in the experts of the energy that we have to think about that the energy nationalism towards also the next winter is not there. So how we can ensure that this coordinated energy policies actually are working. Moreover to that, to elaborate on the point which I just mentioned is that a winter protectionism actually can damage not only the energy security generally, but actually can have much more impact on the economic markets as well, and the functioning of the electricity market, for instance, in the longer term as well. And here is one thing what raises concern for me as well. We know that the European Commission published a great initiative Repower EU, right? It actually works a lot, and now we have the discussion over the price cap. But I think that what we forget is the other coin of that side, is that we are starting to use, actually forget the balance. We don't think about who will pay the indifference in the price cap. There is a lot of things we are not actually thinking about. And to add to that, I think that we also in the EU, when we talk about the energy security, have no this exclusive power to think about that now we will take a decision on the short term, how to resolve the energy security crisis right now, but don't think about the long term, because the how we build the strategies, the actually plans of towards the strategy should have this long-term vision right now. Unfortunately, this is the reality, and I think that some of the member states tend to forget about that. This is one point about the energy nationalism. The second point I think that also we have to talk about when we talk about the energy security is the vulnerable ones. And this is about the communication towards our citizens. I think that the national governments actually should improve the communication, and this is what we saw with the COVID pandemic. Given the fact that there is a lot of upcoming elections in 2023, and not only that, the current economic crisis because of the energy crisis and now the economic instability in the society is actually giving dissatisfaction with the European Union towards the vulnerable groups. And I think that the national governments actually should work on the communication with the society, because given your Karina presentation right now, it actually resonates with the one more factor. We still have the countries who doesn't understand the difference between environment and climate change. We still have the countries who doesn't understand what is the actual problem with the climate change. And to be honest, I come from Latvia, and I can assure you, we don't have a lot of climate change experts there, not at all. And people, we have the environmental society. People do not understand why we have to worry about the climate change if we have 50% of the forests, we are green enough. So what's the thing there? Why we have to actually work towards that? And that's why I also believe that, for instance, the COP27 with the loss and damage fund actually showed us that it is possible to have the coordinated policy in general. And also this communication can boost, of course, the willingness from the society as well to participate, not only in the climate change, but also if we look together on the energy security, how we can actually help to improve the country's energy. And the last point is about general EU resilience. And here is two things. I know that we talk a lot about United States withdrawal from the European Union continent, Europe continent, that we have to talk about our ability to actually be independent, more resilient, how we can achieve that. But I think that there is one important thing which we forget, is that what comes after Ukraine, what comes after that. And I come from the conference when I talked with my good colleagues in the United States, and they said that the United States is not withdrawing from the Europe region generally, but they are tired that we get them as for granted. And they indicated the tendency that we will be actually after Ukraine, the images that the United States helped us to win the war in Ukraine. But the energy infrastructure, Europe's energy infrastructure, will be on the European Union shoulders. So here is the question: are we really able to do that? Will we be able to do that? The general rebuilding the energy infrastructure. I know that in the previous panel we talked about the aid, but the infrastructure of the Europe's continent will be on the European Union shoulders. And even though, for instance, to elaborate on that, we should also talk not only about Ukraine, but also what happens with Russia. Should we just ignore Russia in the continent? That there is nothing connected to that? I think given the energy infrastructure system, it's simply impossible to do that. And I think I will stop here because each of the points could be elaborated on, but I will stop here. So
thank you very much, Alexandra, and a lot, I think, food for thought and stuff on the table. Also going to be interesting to hear what the audience responds to in your introductory remarks. So I'll hand over to Simone, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs for inviting me. Thank you for TEPSA for inviting me. When I had the invitation in my inbox, I was thinking back that my first TEPSA conference was 23 years ago. In 1999, ahead of the first Finnish presidency, rotating presidency. It's great that this initiative, the TEPSA conference series, has survived the attempts to reform the rotating presidency, which of course is a symbol of sharing leadership and equality between the EU member states, which is something that's been at the heart of particularly of small member states. I'll stop there and tell you what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes. So I would like to situate the discussion that we've had thus far into a broader security context and reflect. So that's my first goal. My second goal is to reflect specifically about the external security dimension of climate change and on EU action in this area, to complement a bit what Karina started and then Alexandra continued. And I want to conclude with recommendations to the Swedish presidency. So let me start by situating the discussion about climate change, energy sustainability into a broader security context. And I want to sort of take us back to what Karina said at the outset. Sweden is taking on the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union when we are facing multiple crises, not only one crisis, not only Ukraine. The impacts of rapid environmental and climate change are felt increasingly by populations around the world. And the images of floods don't only reach us from Pakistan, they also reach us from Germany. So, of course, Ukraine is top of mind. It brought major war back to Europe. And it's connected to the current energy crisis, which we just heard about. And it's also connected to a looming economic recession. But we shouldn't forget the global ripple effects. And here I'm thinking not only about images of floods, but the food insecurity in widespread regions in the world. And of course, unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only armed conflict. Armed conflicts actually are at a record high since World War II. Non-state armed groups are proliferating, and we've heard this morning, or in earlier discussions rather, numbers of forcibly displaced people are mounting. All of this, of course, is happening while countries are still dealing with the social, political, and economic effects of the COVID pandemic. So I think the main argument I want to bring forward in this first part of my talk is that we are living at a time of converging crises. And if we just engage on one, we don't really manage to solve anything, because it's a new era of risks, as one of the recent CERV publications has argued. How do we secure peace and build an environment of peace in this new era of risk? And I think here, while at the helm of the European Union, Sweden has a key responsibility to keep the spotlight on the linkages between all these interconnected crises and risk, and particular the linkages between the environmental crisis and the security crisis. So we should try to avoid that crisis management with regard to Ukraine hijacks the need to address these multi-crises, which Karina also alluded to in her presentation. So I think Sweden has a tremendous opportunity to spotlight and to push for joint solution at the European level, to spotlight the need to investment in this preparedness and resilience that we've heard about throughout the TEPSA conference today, and do so in the most climate vulnerable places. So of course there's a domestic dimension to it, but there's also a development and an external dimension to this. And of course Sweden should push for this transition towards a greener world economy. And of course I'm working or a researcher at a Peace Building Institute, so I would like to stress that this transition has a lot of risks connected to it, and the risk is further conflict. So the transition doesn't only need to be green, it needs to be peaceful, and it needs to be just. So this is my attempt to just sort of take this topic and put it into the broader context. My second point is to reflect a little more about what specifically do we mean by the external security dimension of climate change, and what has the EU already been doing in this area. So what do we mean by climate-related security risks? We mean risks to people's well-being, to people's livelihood, that emerge from climate change, but then have these cascading effects, as you said, for societal, economic, and political stability. And this can be seen at the local level, it can be seen at the national level, but also regionally and internationally more broadly. So when we talk about climate-related security risks, we talk about the interconnection between climate impacts, human security, and political stability or societal stability. Of course, whether climate change does indeed, have these cascading risk effect, or does indeed translate into human security risk and then trigger societal, economic, political instability, depends on many intervening factors. Amongst them, the political government structures in place. And just to give a few examples, climate-related security risks can, for example, emerge from the inability to cope with extreme weather events. This is true for domestically, but it's also true externally, because the ability to cope domestically within the EU tends to be a little higher in developed countries than in developing countries. There can be food insecurity would be another example. Food insecurity can be triggered by climate impacts that happen very, very far away. And of course, it can also be the result of unintended consequences, maladaptation or malmitigation, for example. The EU has recognized this linkages between climate change and security already since the early 2000s. Last time I counted, we had 27 Council conclusions acknowledging the links between climate change and security. The problem is that there remains this gap between the rhetoric and the broad Council conclusions and really concrete initiatives to stem and address climate-related security risks. The responses we are observing focus either on the very long term, so here we are talking about emission reduction, which is of course very, very important. We're talking about mitigation, climate mitigation, or the responses tend to focus on the immediate crisis response. That's the very, very short term. So what do we do about those risks that are already visible today in the short to medium term? And this is where the action is missing. There are many barriers that have sort of prevented this type of action. And one is simply, and this will not surprise us, but not all member states have seen this as a priority. To address climate-related security risks hasn't been on the radar screen of all member states to the level that they prioritize this. And this might be connected to the fact that some simply see it, oh, we are doing mitigation and adaptation, and that's enough. There's other issues, structural barriers, for example. It's really difficult to coordinate cross-cutting issues, and climate change and security are cross-cutting issues. And it's also really complex to address climate-related security risks, because you're asking policymakers to design initiatives that link or address climate change, peace, security, and development, and do this all at the same time. The good news. Sweden has a reputation as a leader in this area, together with Germany. We had a lot of critical, cynical remarks about Germany in the previous speech. But in the area of climate-related security risk, we did a comparative study, and Sweden, together with Germany, really emerged as two countries that attempt to mainstream these linkages between climate change and security across the different policy domains, and also shape agendas in this field at the multilateral level. And I think this expectation of leadership by the Swedish presidency in this particular area are really high, particularly by some of the EU institutions, the External Action Service, for example, that has really done a lot of work in this area. And this takes me to my third point. What's the way forward? What are some recommendations? What can Sweden do during its forthcoming presidency of the Council of the European Union? Well, Sweden can certainly help give greater prominence on the EU agenda to dossiers related to climate security. it can build or fine-tune existing responses or build on existing responses to address climate-related security risks in order to narrow that gap that exists between the rhetoric and the practice. And I think the presidency is also in a very good position to provide some platforms where diplomacy, development, and also defense entities exchange their views on what are these risks, how can they be addressed, what is their impact. To give a few more concrete examples of what difference Sweden could make, and I think this is the first one is particularly important. I think Sweden could shift attention to both the quantity and quality of climate finance. What's happening at the moment? That the most vulnerable contexts don't necessarily receive context-sensitive climate adaptation. So my argument is that conflict-sensitive climate adaptation needs to reach the most vulnerable context. And what's happening today too is that existing adaptation efforts in fragile contexts do not necessarily address the conflict drivers, or are sensitive to the maladaptation risks that I referred to earlier. So I think Sweden could really shift the focus here. It could help shift the focus to how member states are allocating their climate aid, the extent to which it contributes to peace and security, and the extent to which it addresses root causes of vulnerabilities. And I'm seeing my time is running fast, so I'll try to go a little faster and then conclude. We can come back to some of the details of what this may look like later. There are many existing initiatives that Sweden could help implement or push for more concrete or complete implementation. And here I'm thinking about the EU's concept for an integrated approach to climate change and security, the strategic compass for security and defense, the climate change and defense roadmap. There's a lot of interesting work ongoing, but the implementation is not complete. So there's little things, and I can give examples if you're interested in that, what this could look like. Maybe let me point out one concrete example that sort of connects to the previous discussions. There is already in the climate change and defense roadmap the thinking that there should be more systematic inter-regional dialogue. And I think Sweden would be really well placed to foster or push for more inter-regional systematic dialogue. And this means the EU with the OSCE, the EU with NATO, etc. Finally, I think Sweden in the chair of the Council presidency should really ensure that member states keep their eye on the ball. And what do I mean here? The eye on the ball in terms of reducing energy dependency on Russian gas and phasing out fossil fuels, of course. What I find really, taking the developing perspective or the external perspective, what I find really concerning is that some of the emergency measures that we observe in some member states include reactivating coal-fired power stations and what's so concerning, not only the short-term effect on emissions, because the targets in the long term haven't changed. There's still commitment to reduce emissions in the long term, but it reduces any leverage the EU might have over the global south to give up coal. And that I find concerning. To conclude, to achieve progress, so we have these converging crises, we have climate-related security risks, and to achieve progress, Sweden will need to work very, very closely with the External Action Service. It will need to work very closely with the European Commission, with the permanent chairs of the PSC and the geographical working groups. It can also rely on a group of like-minded states. And what I find really encouraging, and to finish on a positive note, is the recent formation of a group of friends by 11 countries in the EU to drive green action. That's a good resource to rely on and for action, to address root causes, to mobilize and pool resources, to enhance resilience, preparedness, to share lessons and cooperate and coordinate initiatives to stem climate-related security risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone. I think that was a great kind of way of, I think, wrapping up this initial phase of the panel and starting to connect some of the dots that we kind of put in front of you all. I'd like to ask each one of you a question, kind of as a response to your interventions, and then I'll also like to kind of open up for the possibility to you guys to kind of respond to the others if you have any need to do that, and then we'll open up to the rest of the participants here in the room. Now, for Carina, I found that many of the kind of the points that you made were very, I think, pertinent and extremely interesting. There was something that you kind of ended with on the kind of the shift, something happening with kind of the planning. Because you were saying that there is a difference between kind of a focus on crisis preparedness and the kind of the whole conceptual apparatus around societal risks, and then the kind of the climate policy that usually kind of comes down to local planning, basically, to have it implemented, to have its effect. But then you said something about the shift, something happening when planning becomes risk. What is the trade-off here, you think? Is it because is the risk perspective making climate policy on a local level less effective? Is that something that we need to take care of, or what is the kind of the take-home message that is a little bit broader also when you think about how we do or think about EU climate policy or policy making in the EU when it comes to that issue? That was something that I'd like to hear more about from you, if possible. Alexandra. Very interesting intervention, I think. You ended also with, I think, a clear message to kind of start actually, that we need to think about the long term and ask ourselves what comes after Ukraine and what to do with Russia. Of course, Russia is not going to go anywhere, and also, of course, to keep that thought in our heads. What kind of relationship with the U.S. is we envisioning after Ukraine. But to me, it would be interesting to hear you reflect more, maybe on the trade-offs, because you said, or maybe I didn't understand it correctly, but there was a kind of sense that you said that there is a huge kind of trade-off involved if we try to get out of energy relations with Russia. But I guess some would say, look, the whole idea here is that we're actually going to reduce the energy dependence and relations with Russia, and that is actually going to put ourselves in a much better position, right? And of course, I guess if you really want to go for energy autonomy in Europe, renewables is the only way forward, because we don't have basically all other energy sources we need to import, basically. So it would be interesting to hear you reflect more on the kind of the trade-offs here. Maybe there is something here for us to ponder further. And to Simone, excellent presentation, of course. But to me, I was thinking, if you like, this is, I don't know if it's controversial or something, but we're here to advance our thinking and understanding our issues. But do you think there are more trade-offs also on the kind of that goes beyond something that you mentioned, that there is, of course, a risk that so much focus on Ukraine kind of hijacks the agendas that we need to also think about the kind of the long-term issues on when it comes to climate. But do you think that actually there are more dilemmas or trade-offs involved in kind of the way that now Europe is helping Ukraine with, financially, humanitarian or military? Does that in some way, you think, exacerbate climate risks or climate security risk in this region, or is there actually no such risk at all? So is there a kind of a climate security component to the aid that we're seeing being poured into Ukraine, of course, for the sake of helping Ukraine win this war? Since you're in peace building, I guess that you're coming from CIPRI, these kind of trade-offs better than most of us. So with that, I'd like to hand over to you again, and then of course feel free to comment on each other and or raise points that you find or that you wanted to add but did not feel that you had the time now in your first round. So Carina, would you like to start?
Sure. I think that is the question. I won't be able to resolve it, but I can. I have some thoughts. You could do a PhD on this, really. But so I guess just to reframe your question is whether riskifying, in this case, climate away from local planning and towards a more sort of securitized, riskification will change the way we treat climate adaptation, and if it does, how does it change? I don't really know, but I think just to deconstruct this question a little bit, there's at least two ways to look at this or to tackle the question. There might be more, but that's what I can come up with now. First is how an issue is treated. So let's take wind power as an example. Wind power maybe is more often, at least in the Swedish context, presented as an aspect related to a just transition and renewable energies. And wind power faces a lot of opposition. And it's very much up to the local municipality and the region to decide, and if people oppose, then you can't have wind power. What happens if you start treating wind power as a security issue, as a critical infrastructure that needs to be expanded in order to uphold society's security? What would happen with that dynamic? That's one question. The second is, if we change how we treat an issue, what are the implications? So in this case, if we would change how the whole, climate is a lot of stuff included. It's energy, it's nature, it's water, it's many things. But if you change how at least some issues within climate are treated, how will the dynamics change? Will it become more effective? What happens with the democratic process and the right to say no to, in this case, for example, wind power? What happens with issues of justice? What happens with transparency? When we look at, for example, the Swedish defense, it's not really transparent what happens or why. There's no room for questioning or understanding whether it's even needed. And what happens if you start putting climate in a box? I know in theory, at least a theory on securitization speaks that it could get much more importance at a higher politics level. But there could also be trade-offs, talking about trade-offs on treating climate issues as a security agenda. So I think that is a question, and I think we need to, at least from a research point of view, start exploring it more from the practical level. What happens at the practical level, at the local, at the national, at the EU level, if we start changing not just the discourse, but also the regulations around how we treat an issue?
Thank you very much, Karina. Alexandra.
Yeah. To retake, actually, more to elaborate on what you also indicated about the renewables. I think this is the most significant part is what I was also trying to make is that how we can actually continue going by not replacing one dependency to the another one. Because renewables, we can actually talk about the future or a dependency on China, for instance. So we have to keep in mind, first of all, how we can actually secure that we are not dependent later on or the another dependency, and moreover, how we can actually build the resilience and address our dependency, which is we can actually have currently. And to elaborate about becoming independent from Russia, let me give you the example. The European Commission actually was talking about that starting from 2014, when the Crimea happened. And to put it in a nutshell, actually the Baltic states starting the initiative to become independent from buying gas from Russia back in 2014, and we was planning to finish our policy till 2025. So we was moving for that direction. That's why, for instance, we decided that the Latvia actually announced that starting from the next year, 1st January, we will not buy any gas from Russia at all. So for us, giving our movement towards that direction, it was quite easy to do. But then we have the countries who are, let me give an example, Nord Stream. For them, the general energy security and dependencies is on a completely different level. So actually, I also wanted to elaborate a bit on what Karina said also about the wind powers. I completely agree with you on the wind powers problem and the security issue. And here I also wanted to say example again. Sorry for jumping back to the Baltic states, but that could be actually the example of how the attitude on the society is actually changing. So for almost past 10 years, our society was declining the ability of the wind power. So no offshore wind power. No wind parks at all, and the initiative was always lacking behind because of the society and the municipalities. And yet now we actually made that as a security issue, and now we will have two new initiatives coming towards the wind power. One of them is the offshore wind power, and the second one that we will build the wind parks in the forestries. So that's the new things what actually are meanwhile processing. And to actually mention one more thing, I think that we have to come back to the trade-off, sorry for jumping, but I think that we have to also talk about the like-minded partners, as Simone said, that the transatlantic, the energy security deals could be a potential future. We saw this, for instance, with the European Commission conducted us an Raw Material Act. This is actually a good example when we are actually reducing our dependency on China for the raw materials, and we saw that this transatlantic deals could be with the like-minded partners as Japan, United States, South Korea, and potentially our future, how we actually can work on that. I think, yeah, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Simone?
So I think it's really, really important to look at trade-offs. And if I understood your question correctly, you're sort of provoking by asking, will helping Ukraine potentially exacerbate climate risks elsewhere? So let me say maybe 2 or 3 things here. First of all, I think that Ukraine and the Ukraine war has really added pressure to address the links between the environment, natural resource management, and conflict. And that this pressure can lead, I mean, there's risk, but there's also an opportunity. There's an opportunity to speed up the transition to greener economies and do this in a peaceful and just way. Whether this will indeed happen, the verdict is still out. At the moment, we saw a lot of overshadowing that the Ukraine crisis might overshadow, and it's a complicated transition. So here the verdict is still out. Does it mean that aid might be prioritized to Ukraine and chop away from aid to the global south? It probably does, and we've seen some of this. But, and here I want to always I'm an optimistic person, so I want to highlight some of the bright spots maybe. The EU budget until 2027 has this 30% target for climate action, and that also applies to the NDICI, the cooperation funding. So we can use that money in a smart way. And then the other thing I want to encourage member states to think about, when we did our screening or mapping of member states' efforts, what do they do in terms of linking climate change, security, etc., we found that at least 5 member states have their own projects in the Sahel. What about pooling resources, coordinating these efforts, and making the projects more impactful, more coordinated, and joint? So I think there's a lot of still sort of synergy finding and coordinating of complementary efforts that member states are at the moment doing at national level individually, but there's really a scope, and this includes, that's why I hope the Swedish presidency will venture into this space of, mobilizing the resources that are available in a really smart way, so that there won't be such a big trade-off. And maybe this takes me to the short term and the long term, and these kind of trade-offs that travel between our different contributions. I think one should tackle or have short-term and long-term initiatives at the same time. Again, I'm coming back to this point. In this new era of risk, we can't only think about the long-term. Then we would only work on reducing emissions. But then we don't have anything to tackle the floods that we already see, and with the human security and human lives being lost at the moment, right? We have to do it simultaneously. And that's the challenge, but that's also what's needed. And this is what I think will mark sort of forward thinking. Let's not have, do one thing at the expense of another. Let's try to do it jointly, do it better, do it in a more coordinated way. And I think that Sweden has been a very clever coalition builder in the past, has brilliant civil servants who I here in Brussels, there's now 200 people at the permanent representation. So I think Sweden is in a good spot to take on the challenge.
Thank you for that uplifting end, Simone. Okay, so I'll think we're approaching that time when we're going to open up to the audience for comments and questions. But okay, let me then, before I do that, ask the three of you the same question and see how you respond to that. We heard from the previous, or I think it was the first panel this morning from Hans Wallmark, where he assured us that the Swedish government had read the TEPSA recommendations duly and are reflecting upon them for that 10% that allegedly is basically up to Sweden to kind of work on, since so much is, of course, already in the pipeline. And of course, if you look at the climate legislative package, a lot is, of course, what is going to depend on what the Czech Republic is going to be able to do now in the last stint of their presidency. So in a couple of weeks, we'll know, right, a little bit more concretely. But what Sweden has on its plate, in a sense. But if there's anything here you'd like to kind of stress, is there anything here in terms of the policy agenda or the items where you really think that, if Sweden only had to kind of focus on one thing to get that through, if you think about climate now, or something else that Alexander, you mentioned, of course, energy and price, kind of the difficulties to get the price cap there. But is there anything, an item that you would like to highlight for Sweden to really work on?
In my opinion,
you start, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I will start. I think that Sweden, the first priority for Sweden is actually to address the critical infrastructure. That includes a lot. To be honest, but we know that this is the most prior goal, given the geopolitical order which we now have. So to put it in a short term, then in a short wording, then the critical infrastructure is the one what Sweden actually have to work on currently right now. And Simone, I completely agree with you. That's why I said that we don't have this exclusive power to choose short term or long term. We have to work on that right now at the same time, and that's why I agree with you on that point as well.
Thank you, Alexander.
I think I'll follow on. Can you hear me? Yes. I think I'll follow along the same lines. I think that for Sweden, whatever you think about the Swedish election and the government, people voted, and I think we need to listen to what voters have said. And safety was a main concern for this election, safety at home, safety in general. And I think that there's a strong potential, a real potential to connect safety with resilience, primarily so people understand what climate is about. I think there's been a failure of research of everybody to materialize what climate means in the everyday and how climate impacts safety. And now I'm getting into another presentation, sorry, but we see parallels on community safety, like classic safety and criminality issues with spatial planning and vulnerability to climate change. These are not too far away. There are opportunities to connect them and to make contributions, even with Sweden's priorities. And for that, I think that the Swedish government will have to work from home, as that's their priority, and then scale up to the EU, in contrast to what perhaps we've seen before, which is a more international-oriented government. And I still think that there's opportunities to do that, and I think critical infrastructures is a good channel mechanism.
Thank you, Carina. Simone?
So I find this really hard to just pinpoint one, particularly in the area of stemming climate-related security risks. There's so much incremental change that can make a big difference if it all comes to fruition. But since I'm only allowed to mention one thing, I would like to say to work on closing the gap between rhetoric and practice. And why is this so important? Because there's so much EU bashing going on, and so much questioning even about of democratic systems and can they deliver on climate change. But we all have our criticisms and are very fast to highlight the failures. But if there are gaps between rhetoric and practice, it eats away at that credibility at a time when we need all the trust and credibility in our institutions, particularly at multilateral level, that we need in order to solve global cross-cutting issues. So if there's one thing that I would highlight is to really work at closing gaps between rhetoric and practice and spotlighting where action is possible and progress is possible in order to rebuild, maintain, strengthen trust in the European Union as one of the multilateral fora that can make a difference in all kinds of different areas, from peace and conflict to internal markets and to the everyday lives of European citizens.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to open to you. Guys, we have Lars-Erik in the back. I'll see if I can collect a few questions or comments, and I'll see. So please, and introduce yourself to the ones who don't know you.
I'm Lars-Erik Lundin. I'm also associated with CEPRI and some other institutions. I'm a former EU bureaucrat, and together with Jim and others, we have lived through a period of, in my case, 25 years, when we started discussing security and the issues that you are talking about today in two different worlds. Security was not to be discussed in the Commission context. It was an intergovernmental issue. So consequently also many people in the Commission had no idea about the security consequences of the decisions that they were proposing, including the market issues, for instance, privatization, all kinds of things that we did that increased our vulnerabilities. So you would argue that it's good when we have converging crises, as Simon mentioned, that we have a more coherent approach to the whole thing, including security. But then, as Carina quite correctly says, we have a lot of problems coming with that. What about the subsidiarity principle and so forth, the democratic principles and so on? So the question is, you mentioned, Carina, if we start discussing these things in another way, what you, I suppose, implicitly allude to is the possibility that decisions will actually be taken on a very high level, which will impact on the independence of even individual countries. And do we want that? Is that something we have to do now when we are having all these converging crises? When you listen to the Commission President, you get that feeling. She speaks in the first person singularis. I will do this and that. And this is, for me, as a previous Commission, completely extraordinary that you have come to that point. So how do you see this as a threat, that the European Union is becoming a unitary actor? Or do you see it as an opportunity which would actually require further treaty changes beyond the Lisbon Treaty?
Thank you very much, Lars-Erik. Let's see if there are more questions from the audience or interventions, comments, reflections. Yeah, we have another one. Okay. Sure, you go first, and then we'll take the one in the back. Yeah.
No, thank you very much, Jean-Louis de Brouwer from the Egmont Institute in Brussels. I would like to follow on what Carina Barquet said when you referred to safety. It resonates with a meeting that I was attending yesterday afternoon, a meeting of a body that Jim knows also, which is a scientific committee of another think tank, which is European Policy Center. And key topic was, mind you, Ukraine and its consequences on different policy strands at EU level. Somebody during the discussion said something which resonates still with me. And he was comparing, this crisis to the previous one, which is still with us, the pandemic. He said, what worries me is that we are nowadays in a me first phase. Me first. Individuals, local communities, and states. We more or less managed to get out of this me first phase after the first months of the pandemic, when member states came to the view that after all, instead of stealing stocks from each other, buying vaccines together was maybe the way out. There is a fear that we might get stuck in this me first phase when dealing with the consequences of what is now happening in Ukraine, in the region, and worldwide. Because what we heard together this afternoon, is that this discussion that we are having, with a few exceptions, are terribly Eurocentric. Terribly Eurocentric. And I would add one last final comment. Of course, I mean, this meeting is meant to address recommendation to the incoming Swedish presidency. But the presidency lasts 6 months. We are dealing with, I mean, existential issues that will stay with us beyond the 6 months terms, whatever the performance, and it will be a great performance of the Swedish presidency. Which means that it will come to the next presidencies. And who is taking over the chair during the second half of 2024? Hungary. So where does that lead us?
Thank you very much. And we'll collect another question from the man in the back, and then we'll hand it over to the panelists.
Thank you very much. Glenn Hodgson from Free Trade Europa. Just a quick 2 questions there as well. I like the point that you raised before about sort of presidency begins at home approach. And just to say a little bit more about the concerns at the moment with the cost of living crisis in terms of where should the focus be in that sense, but also at the broader level, looking at where we are at the moment in terms of this pulling back the borders in terms of the free trade and the openness is something of the past, which much more sort of digital sovereignty in a European context. And it really goes on to the gentleman's comment there as well, that we seem to be looking in on ourselves as opposed to looking outwards. And could we say a little bit more about that?
Thank you very much. 3 broad questions in a broad panel with 3 very good speakers. So I'm very curious to hear your responses. Should we go Carina first?
Yes, I will try my best to say something smart about this. About the first question on the EU as a unitary actor, I wasn't necessarily suggesting that. I think your comment goes along with the second comment. In fact, it's you are much more of EU experts than I am. But I think if we look at the democratic situation in the EU, there does not seem to be much support for having EU as a unitary actor at the moment. It's a lot of countries are turning inwards. Definitely is the case of Sweden, even if it's a more sort of subtle tone than in other countries. So I don't know really if one would take up this type of high-level decisions, whether the EU is the right level to do it at this point. However, in Sweden, which is a very decentralized country at the moment, many decisions are extremely decentralized. So I'm not suggesting either or the other. My suggestion is to explore what the impacts of bringing it up to a higher, more securitized level would be. And I think this is important for both for or against arguments. We need to understand what that means, the implications of it. So that was to your comment. And then the second on safety, which I think it goes along with the first comment, the me first phase, the pandemic, to Eurocentric, a lot of the discussions that were brought up earlier. I would say that the third comment maybe had an answer. I think we need to start at home rather than start from a Eurocentric approach again at the moment. And I think maybe not suggestion, my hypothesis is that I think that looking into what matters the most for us today, for me as a person, as a woman, as a family member, is what I depend on every day. And climate is just too far away. And the EU is really disconnected from our everyday life for a normal citizen, which is essentially the person that votes. So I think turning into what supplies us every day could be a way to bring, again, the discussion on climate and the impacts that the environment environmental change is having on us a bit closer to our everyday life. I do think Sweden, let's say, Sweden might have more of an opportunity to gain from these 6 months, or us Swedish might gain from these 6 months of the Swedish chairmanship than the EU from Sweden in this case. If it can be used for bringing something up or understanding something in a different way. In this case, my suggestion of connecting safety and resilience, that would be great for us, and I think it would be a good contribution to the EU. I hope I didn't roam around too much and I was clear.
Thank you, Carina. I'll hand it over to you, Simone.
Yes. Great questions. Let's see if I can answer most of them in a coherent way. So first of all, I want to say that I see still plenty of disunity in the European Union. The EU has become so much more diverse since Eastern enlargement, and especially in the foreign policy or external sphere. Despite the Commission having made inroads into the space, it's still pretty member state dominated. And, you know, if I do interviews, let's say with the External Action Service, or they always stress, oh, we don't have the mandate, we don't have the mandate. So this intergovernmental element is still very strong, and there is really plenty of disunity. What I find worrying, and maybe that's sort of the counter part, or the other flip side of the coin that you brought up, is that whenever there's a big crisis, member states tend to turn inwards rather than rely on the EU to say, okay, maybe it's better to work together here, because the first instinct is, oh, we are responsible to the constituencies who have elected us, so they go and turn inward, looking and national. And I mean, this takes us a little bit away from the climate sphere, but nowhere was this recently so visible as with managing the COVID pandemic. We had in record time, we had a vaccine, but the rollout of the vaccine had many, many problems. And also on a pretty existential health risk, let's say. So there is this problem that the moment crisis hits, countries tend to turn inward, and what then happens is that the outcome is suboptimal. So in that sense, the designing or strengthening, let's say, institutional structures that incentivize unity over disunity, I think is encouraging. There will still be plenty of disunity that will remain. So that maybe, I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope I addressed it. And then of course, 6 months are incredibly short. And of course, here we are raising very high expectations, on a single country. But again, there are other structures that try to foster a degree of continuity that didn't exist before the Lisbon Treaty. We have trio presidencies that coordinate. We do have, in different formations, permanent chairs. We have a European Council president. We have the high rep in foreign policy. So I think we still have the messiness of this flock of birds that was mentioned at the outset of the conference. But at least we should try to propel that this messy flock of birds flies into the right direction. And I think that's the kind of leadership that's needed. I don't know if that addresses your question, but I think there are some structures in place that ensure that the issues don't just fall by the wayside. And if you look specifically at climate change and the linkages between climate change and security, I'm afraid that's a topic that's going to stay with us for many, many years. So I don't think it will be an individual member state that can just drop all these converging issues. And for that, 6 months is really short too. There will always be others who keep the spotlight in all the different subgroupings that exist of like-minded member states, for example, in the EU, to ensure continuity.
Thank you very much, Simone. And I guess that the crucial distinction here is if we're talking about the treaty-based flock of birds or just a random flock of birds, right? I guess that makes the whole distinction. Jim, would you like to have 2 fingers on that? Okay, 2 fingers, and then we leave it to Alexandra.
I'm sorry, Alexandra. I agree with most of what you said, and I think it's very interesting. I slightly disagree with Simone. I think there is one point which is important to understand. Everybody talks about disunity. Disunity is a normal starting position. How on earth do you want 27 different countries? Take one country, Sweden. Do you ever seen that in a big crisis, 100% of the Swedes agree on everything? They have a parliament to discuss it. We have the European Council, we have the Commission, we have the institutions. On COVID, I must say, it is entirely natural that the first reaction was national. Why? Because the running of the health system is a national or regional competence. But I thought that in that particular crisis, very quickly, the EU grew together and not apart. The procurement together, huge success. Even the run-out, actually. There were some problems initially because of the terrible behavior of AstraZeneca, I'm sorry to say here. They were really awful. And that created a public backlash, but actually compare us to China. And secondly, within 6 months, the European Union adopted the RRF fund of 750 billion. So, I mean, frankly, in this area, whereas it took us a long time in the economic crisis a few years ago, and we were slow and chaotic, I think on COVID, we've actually grown together. And my last point is that if you take all the crises since 2008, my strong feeling, and not only feeling, my conviction is that we are much more integrated without any treaty change than we were in 2008. And I could give you a long list of very concrete points on that. But it's not a fundamental disagreement. It's a way of putting things. Thank you.
Yes, I don't think we disagree, because I think disunity, maybe it's a bad word. Maybe we should talk about the messiness of democracy more generally. And there I'm absolutely, maybe it didn't come across the same way, but this is what democracy is all about. It's messy, it's about compromising, about finding compromise, and when the EU shines is when they make these compromises happen. And on COVID, what I would highlight as the positive is the quick learning. Quick learning and adjusting. There I think the EU has something to show as well. Let's hope that those structures also last and we don't have to learn from scratch, next time a crisis hits us. So there we go.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Jim. Okay, Alexandra, you will get the last word, and then we'll finish.
I think to retake what just Simone said, to not learn from scratch, I think that, as Jim just said, the crises are part of the EU for the past decades, and I think that this, for us, isn't just a normal thing to talk about that, okay, this is a new crisis where we actually have to address, we learn a lot, we build the resilience management, and we move forward, but the crises are an essential part of the EU, and I completely agree, and Jim partly took away my words that I think, well, I'm no functional supporter, so I truly believe that actually crisis helps us to become even more integrated inside of the European Union. And this is what we actually saw on the last actions. Let me give you an example. EU Defense Military Fund. First time in EU history, EU actually provided the military support. That's quite a thing. First ever in the history, because the European Union was created actually as an economic actor, not as a military one. So that's actually shows us the ability to actually take decisions. How fast all the member states reacted in the war in Ukraine. First sanction packages. Not only that, that all shows how actually we are able and competitive to actually take decisions. And to put back to the rhetorics of the climate change, then the climate change become part of the EU only some 20 years ago, and now we have the Green Deal policy, so that's quite a thing. This is how we can actually be united, and I honestly think that unity reactor of the EU is an opportunity, because we can have these initiatives which actually helps us to take more decision on a broader scale. And coming from the small country, I can assure you that if wouldn't we have the common vaccine pact, how we wouldn't get the vaccines, because we come from the small country. That wouldn't be possible for us. So definitely there is a lot to actually talk about as a EU as a unity reactor. And to actually conclude that, I also think that what is important to talk around, it's not only about the crises generally, but also asymmetrical crises and the future shockwaves, what we actually can address. And then there is the thing that EU being as an actor and actually taking more capacity to become geopolitical commission, for instance, helps us to address these issues inside the European Union.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll end the panel. Thank you very much for joining us and listen and your comments. Join me, please, in a round of applause for our panelists.